All right, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Friday, March 11th of 2022. Got some exciting news yesterday that the baseball lockout has officially ended. So we've got an opening day date here now of Thursday, April 7th. It looks like the season will be starting off, at least as far as I could tell, with a lot of double headers, probably a lot of slates where we have both or probably a lot of days where we have both an early slate and the main evening slate pretty much every day, which is a pretty exciting way to kick off baseball season. That will, of course, come along with us doing some updates and some content about the work that we've done this offseason on our baseball model. And then also, just some new versions, some 2022 versions of our baseball content, our baseball course, things like that. So very, very excited that baseball is now on the horizon, that we have an actual date for the start of baseball season. We've got daylight savings time kicks up here on Sunday night, I guess, this week. We've got a little bit of green grass coming out of the ground here out by me. It's starting to feel like that time of year. So excited to know that we'll have some baseball going on this spring. We've got a 10-game NBA slate tonight in the meantime here. We had just the 2-gamer last night. I mentioned yesterday on stream, felt a little bit like a sort of a DFS holiday, I guess. It was kind of a quiet DFS day, but right back to it here tonight. 10 games of NBA. I'm sure we'll have a ton of late swap news, craziness as we approach lock. I haven't even actually really looked at this slate too much today, so we'll be interested to see how it's all coming together. But we'll go ahead and start getting into questions here in just a moment. Got a handful of different questions to talk about here today. There were couple questions about creating late swap flexibility in your NBA lineups. And then a few questions kind of more on the follow-up of some topics we've been talking about on the other episodes this week. So, a couple questions about playoff NBA versus regular season, some MLB questions about the model. We'll talk a little bit more about some of my player pool curation ideas and a little bit of looks like some review mode questions here as well. So that's just what we have in the queue for now. As always, go ahead and pop the questions that you have into the Office Hours channel in Slack or YouTube chat if you've got something for me here today. And we'll go ahead and get started. I'm just going to start. This is a real quick one here. And this is from CJ. I think it's the first time I've been asked about this. Maybe not the very first time, but he said, will you plan on having USFL projections if those contests are offered? I'm not even sure if they would be, but I could see it being a possibility. Thanks for all you do. Yeah, it's on our radar as well. I don't believe either FanDuel or DraftKings has committed to USFL DFS yet. I do, at least as far as I remember, I believe DraftKings is the official NFL provider or the official partner in the DFS space to the NFL. So I have some doubts that DraftKings will provide USFL DFS for that reason. We'll see. They might. Maybe a way around that. I believe they had XFL back when that was a thing or when that was running, but I don't know if they had that official partnership with the NFL yet. FanDuel might end up doing it because FanDuel doesn't have that same official partnership. Assuming that one or both or other sites do, it is on our radar. It's something we want to provide. I expect that there's going to be pretty big contests for it just because it's football. Springtime football is always pretty popular in the gambling world. As far as I know, the rules are pretty similar or almost identical to NFL. So I think it'd be relatively easy to get a sim going pretty quickly. The other main question is just basically getting the data that we need to run sims for a league that is basically starting from scratch. There's also quite a few, kind of no-name guys that haven't even really played too much college ball or too much NFL or other leagues that are going to be on there. So, but yeah, we'll see. It's on our radar. So, but cool. All right. Kick to that said, this is not gambling. It's a game of skill. Yes, you're right. The federal government is listening. No, it is. I still feel like it kind of all falls under that same umbrella. Referring to the sports betting, DFS, even like seasonal fantasy sports kind of just space overall. I know USFL will be very popular. So anyway, let's keep it going. And then this brings us to a question from Profit here. And this will kind of, I guess, give us our first question that we can really kind of dive into here today. He said, I noticed that when I run sims for a 20 max sesh single entry, I get a lot of early games. I have little to no room for late swapping opportunities. How can I fix this without sacrificing too much optimization? Interesting question. So yeah, let's talk about that here. So there's a couple things going on. I'm going to first just kind of answer this question literally. Assuming that you want to, get... Well, I would say this. Let's start here. So the first thing I would do is I would start with a test build, right? That's always kind of my answer. Before we start doing anything with groups or rules or filtering the player pool, let's see what we're getting. So we can run the test build, default settings, and just get an idea of who's coming from the early games here. And actually, let's just open this up too. Sometimes I like this dashboard just to see what games are early here. So yeah, we'll treat like 3 games as early today. Minnesota, Orlando, LA at Atlanta, and Detroit at Boston. And we'll just see. Well, the purpose of this is to try to figure out, how much exposure am I getting to players from these games to start with, right? So let's take a look. Okay, so we had Minnesota at Orlando. I'll give this a second to load here. Okay. Man. So actually a fair bit of exposure in this game. A lot of Towns, a lot of Suggs, a lot of Beverly. Let's see. A lot of exposure in this game too. So interesting slate for it tonight. So, okay, and actually a little bit of exposure to this game too. So ultimately, there's a couple things. The first is that, the more exposure you're getting to the early games, the better the plays are in that game. So in other words, like on a slate where there isn't very much excitement in the early games, right? There isn't a lot of good players. You will naturally have a lot more late swap flexibility because you won't have as much roster positions occupied in those games, right? But there's really nothing you were sacrificing to begin with. In other words, in the slates, or there was really nothing you had to do to get that. In the slates where maybe you have to make more rules to give yourself more late swap flexibility, by definition, those are the slates where there are better overall plays in the early games. So I think when you run your test build, this should be something you think about, right? Is ultimately for this question of how, without sacrificing too much optimization, that's not an easy answer that I'm going to just be able to just give to you. It's clear on tonight's slate, for example, that there are quite a few players from these early games that look like pretty good plays. Right, let's look again here, right? So at least, Towns kind of really pops here. I would say Towns is definitely a player that the builder kind of wants to use. Trae Young is definitely a player that the builder wants to use. And I guess that's kind of it in terms of like core. So that's the one thing to look for, right? Is to look at how many players you're getting from the early games, right? Because there are going to be slates where there aren't a lot of good plays in the early games, but tonight there are, right? So getting an idea of how that looks, and then you have some options of how you want to do it. I think on one hand, you could say, you know what, I don't care. I'm willing even to sacrifice Trae Young and Karl Anthony Towns to get late swap flexibility, and I'm just going to cross these games off my list, right? Now you are sacrificing some theoretical EV at luck by getting rid of some of the plays that are playing in these games, but you are gaining back something in the form of late swap flexibility as the slate goes on, right? So this is an option to you. I think another option would be doing this, and instead, actually, let's keep it like this, but keeping in maybe a couple particular players that pop, right? The builder's basically saying to you that the key pieces that you may want from these early games are Towns and Trae Young. And even if you build lineups with both of them, you're still going to have all the other roster positions still available. I think this is a good kind of medium approach, right? Where you're crossing off a lot of the more auxiliary plays that you could kind of use or not use in these games, but you're keeping the plays that really want to pop in your lineups a little bit more, right? I think another option here is, instead of thinking about crossing off early games, it is to set a rule to make sure that you're preserving a portion of your lineup for later games. So I think one way that you can do that, for example, here, is to set a rule and say something like, all lineups must include, let's just say hypothetically 4 players from the same game, but cross off all the teams playing in the early here, right? And that's the Clippers and Hawks, right? And now on one hand, you might say, wait, I don't want 4-man game stacks of all the late games. The point of this isn't necessarily to actually stack up games. The point of this is to preserve at least 4 players playing from not the main games in each individual lineup. And then later you could come back in, delete this rule, and then late swap from there. And you would know that every single lineup would have at least 4 lineup positions that were not used from the early games. You could also do this with a group rule, right? But I think the key point that I want to stress here, especially since the question is written this way, how can I fix this without sacrificing too much optimization, is that it is like basically kind of, it is by definition that the better the plays are in the early games, the more you have to sacrifice to preserve late swap flexibility. In the slates where there's nobody good in the early games anyway, it is very easy to just do this. So like if you are getting a lot of early games, you are probably naturally going to have to sacrifice something to get late swap flexibility if that's what you want. And that's where the trade-off kind of lies. I think my favorite approach personally here of how I would do this is running the test build. Give yourself a list of players that kind of pop or show up and it looks like the builder actually maybe does want to use, and only keep those players specifically in your pool. And that will make sure that you don't incidentally end up with exposure or lineup spots occupied to the random other guys that are showing up in these games, especially on a slate. I guess the one other factor to think about here is how much late swap news potentially could still come out on the slate, right? If there are key players questionable going into lock, I think there's even more value to crossing more players off from the early games. And in this slate too, also, maybe you keep the 5:30 games in there, right? Because you still have a late swap opportunity there. Maybe it's only the 5 o'clock game you're looking at. And maybe you come into just the 5 o'clock game and cross off everybody but Towns, right? I think that's actually a pretty good approach. Maybe Suggs was the other guy that popped up here. And that'll kind of maximize your ability to be flexible as the slate goes on. So let me know if that kind of helps. Again, I think, main things here, run your test build, get an idea of what the slate looks like, get an idea of how valuable players from these early games are in the first place, and then either cross games off, cross most of games off while preserving a select number of players from individual teams in your pool, or set a rule, a stacking rule or grouping rule, making sure that you're preserving 4 or so players from each individual lineup that are playing in the later games. That's how I would tackle it. And remember that, again, if there are good plays in the early games, you are naturally going to have to sacrifice more to get there, or to get more flexibility for late swaps. So good question, though. All right, cool. Couple questions from Carl. What are the primary differences in lineup building between NBA regular season and playoffs? A couple things. Let's see here. I would say overall strategy is not going to have a dramatic change, right? The overall approach to building lineups in NBA is going to be pretty similar. And like, in other words, the sliders themselves are not going to be changing just because it's playoffs time, right? The overall approach to being successful are going to be similar. A few things that do change. I think, first of all, teams will typically run a little bit of a tighter rotation, and the starters will typically get a little bit more run. A lot of times teams cut down to like an 8-man or so rotation, sometimes even 7 or sometimes a 6-man rotation. You'll even see in key games. And in key games, elimination games, they may even run like really tight, right? You can see some of the starters play quite a few minutes. I think one thing that you can do to add value there is be aware of what teams are playing for, what's going on in that particular series, and checking the actual projected minutes, right? You will see sometimes a player would be projected at 40 minutes for a playoff game, which really implies that, there's not that many more minutes that a player could get, right? But if a player is projected at 35 minutes or 34 minutes, it can actually be useful to study that and potentially increase their projection, because there's more room for that projection to go up if the player plays up to 40. Rotations can also be a little bit more unpredictable. Coaches will make sudden changes to sometimes the starting lineup, sometimes the actual, who's playing in what groups off of the bench, who's the first guy off the bench, that kind of thing can change. And the coaches have a very strong incentive to not be very public about that since they are playing in a live playoff series. So on one hand, I would say you typically get less sudden late scratches and randomly players that are ruled out close to their game starting. But the late swap value does kind of change a little bit because starting lineups themselves can be a little bit less predictable in that way. I would say they're overall more predictable, but there's kind of a unique nuance with playoff basketball where a coach may have an incentive to change a starting lineup if it's not really working. And that can be another factor as well. So late swap, I think, comes down a little bit in overall absolute importance, but staying plugged into the news overall is still pretty important to your process in NBA. Overall, though, my approach doesn't really change too much. I would say I am a little bit more. I'm a little bit more inclined to make adjustments to projections if I see that a minutes projection or something looks like it could be a little bit on the lower side, depending on what that team is playing for. Or if I think, having followed the series, that a coach might switch something up in the next game. And those can be kind of hard things. Again, there's not exactly hard and fast rules to say, if this happens, take this action. It's interesting. The net effect, I think, of all this is that it's almost a little bit of an oxymoron where basketball becomes a little bit more predictable in that a rotation is going to tighten. You're going to have less players on the court. There's less late scratches. There's less just like random news. But the coaches themselves will make more kind of, the coaches themselves can make a little bit more sudden changes. And amongst that kind of pool of, whatever the 8 or so guys that are going to be playing, there can be less predictable changes from there. Does that make sense? I realize I feel like I'm saying it's kind of two different ways. I guess maybe the right way to say this is that the variance of the game changes. And instead of dealing with a star getting late scratched, you've got you're dealing with a situation where a defensive specialist who typically comes off the bench is now all of a sudden starting. And you're trying to predict, is that, a specific matchup thing? Is this guy going to play 30 minutes? And the Sims, first of all, the Sims all do a pretty good job of tracking this in general, right? It's not to say that this playoff basketball all of a sudden requires a ton of manual work, but I think you can gain a little bit more value in playoffs in particular by having kind of paid attention to what's going on in the series to that point, and understanding what teams have to play for. Right. I am probably the least narrative driven person in the regular season. Right. When people talk about narratives or imply that maybe someone has more or less to play for on a given night because he's playing his former team or in his hometown or or it's his birthday, the variety of different narratives going on in playoffs, that I think that does have a little bit more of a factor. Right. A team facing an elimination game is going to do things that they might not otherwise have done. And if I'm looking at, a team up against it, right? If you're looking at the Mavericks who are playing and they're down 3-2 and they're playing in game 6 and Luka's projected for 34 minutes, right? That might be what happens. That might be totally fine even as a mean. But if it comes down to it and they're facing elimination in the fourth quarter, Luka might play the entire fourth quarter, right? Like 42 minutes is in his range of outcomes there. And if I'm staring at this, right, that might be an opportunity to increase his projection because of ultimately, right, we're just playing for upside. I don't care about basically virtually anything that happens other than Luka getting his 42% outcome or 42 minute outcome then at that point. And I'll just put it in. So I think looking at, things like popcorn machine to kind of see how rotations change. That's the other thing, is the set of samples that you are working from are going to be, it's again a situation where it's a little bit, I like the oxymoron idea here. There's an oxymoron of, you've got, by game 7, you've watched the same two teams play each other 6 times in a row. And in some ways you have a lot of data to work with about how those two teams are matching up against each other. But on the other, if the coach changes the rotation up in game 6, you or the Sims or any model suddenly needs to decide, is that a trend or is that an outlier? And that's a very hard decision to make, right? That's kind of the metagame of playoff DFS a little bit, is kind of determining what is reliable to change, what has changed and what is reliable or predictive of how things are going to look in the future. So if you haven't already seen Max's video on our YouTube channel in the NBA course, How to Beat Daily Fantasy Basketball Like an NBA DFS Pro, I'd watch this. It's an hour long. Find some time, sometime before the playoffs start, because I think Max's strategy to adjust, to study rotations and make adjustments. In this video, he talks a lot about it from the standpoint of the regular season when you're thinking about injuries and things like that. But I think it also has a ton of value for the playoffs, where if you are taking the time to study how the rotations of certain teams look, and especially sudden changes in those rotations, you can really crush in playoff ball. And I think it's worth doing that. Last note I'll make on this: I think it is worth spending a little bit of time on that. Or maybe spending, there's a couple different things to do, but spending a little bit more time studying rotations and making sharp adjustments to player projections, or studying the ownership projections and making sharp adjustments to ownership, and maybe considering increasing your ownership fade slider. Mainly, all of this is to say because the late swap edge in playoff basketball is going to be smaller, right? When we're going into a regular season slate like this, and we've got an injury report that looks like this, you're virtually guaranteed to get some kind of edge from late swap. It's not always the case in playoff basketball. And when every team's running an 8-man rotation and maybe there's one player questionable on the entire slate, you have a good sense of who's going to play and where minutes are going to go, right? We in some ways lose an edge there. So, or an edge, the late swap edge is lessened. So I like to kind of pop that back up by studying either the rotations or where minutes projections might be a little bit off, or playing an ownership game. Because when starting lineups and minutes and injury reports are more reliable, the ownership can be a little bit more reliable, and we can actually get an edge, a bigger edge on fading chalk. So anyway, I didn't expect to have that much to say about this. We did do a video on this last year, and it was actually 2 years ago now, at least 2 years ago in season time, right? So this was for not the 2021 season, but the end of the COVID season. We did a video where we talked about beating playoff basketball, but I'd have to go dig that up. It's a little old now here, but I think. Let me see. NBA playoffs. Let me see if this pulls it up. Oh, there you go. Yeah. So yeah, we had Max and Danny on, and Andy was on here as well. This video, I guess 9 months ago. It's weird. 9 months ago was actually the end of the COVID season, if I remember correctly, of basketball. So I'd go check this out too as well, because there's a lot of nuggets in here that'll be useful. But anyway, let's keep it going. Let's talk something else here. All right. Carl also asked for MLB to SaberSim and factor in how some pitchers get consistently more run support than others, day versus night, dome versus DraftKings. Yeah, I mean, we do in the sense of like a pitcher that has a greater overall offense supporting him is going to have a better overall chance in the simulations to get a win, right? That's basically the biggest factor here. A pitcher with a better hitting offense behind him will have a better chance to get the win bonus. I guess we'll also have a slightly better chance to potentially. I guess that's really mostly it. So yeah, I mean, in the same way that we can project hitting performance, we can pick up on that. Day versus night, I'm not sure how much we're doing there beyond what is also captured in weather. I'd be interested. Maybe that's a good question. I'm sure we will end up doing a baseball model stream before the start of the season. We are factoring in weather. We're also factoring in park factors. So this question of dome versus grass, that's going to be naturally captured in the park factors, right? We have an understanding of what types of parks are more favorable to hitters, more favorable to pitchers, in what ways they can be more favorable to hitters and pitchers, right? Some parks suppress home runs, others suppress strikeouts, right? We have a sense of that as well. Day versus night, though, is an interesting one. I believe that's probably captured pretty heavily in thinking about weather overall. But that is a good one maybe for me to follow along with the models team. I know you hear things about a park at night in particular being more difficult for hitters to hit in successfully or something like that. I'm not sure how actually predictive that kind of stuff is, but maybe we'll jot that one down in particular to bring up again for the model stream, and maybe just getting a little bit more background on how weather and how park factors are incorporated into the sims would be a good one as well. So again, a lot more baseball content to come. We'll start slowly talking about some baseball strategy, what goes into the sims, things like that on the office hour streams as this gets closer. But I would say probably the week leading up to opening day, we'll probably be hitting the baseball content pretty hard, answering questions on streams, having a couple of the other guys from the team on talking about it as well. And we'll go from there. So, but okay, cool. Question from Tone here. And he said, I was watching yesterday's stream after work, and you mentioned lowering the player filter to 9 fantasy points. On a previous episode, you've described how on a normal slate, you filter by the 95th percentile and see what players have at least 30 projected fantasy points for that outcome and draw a line to that as the fantasy point filter. Yesterday in the small slate, I noticed that going by players that were projected for at least 9 fantasy points, the 95% outcome was 19 to 20 fantasy points. My question is, how do you adjust your process for looking at the 95th percentile outcome to draw a line in the sand depending on the slate size? Is there a general rule of thumb you use? For example, on a 2 to 4 game slate, 19 to 20 fantasy points for the 95th. On a 5 to 9 slate, maybe something like 25 points. Man, I wouldn't say there's really a hard and fast rule, to be completely honest. A lot of times, like I've talked about a lot of these different ways of doing this on stream here. And a lot of times I would say ultimately it kind of revolves around me finding who's the last player that I'm willing to see in my lineups in terms of average fantasy point projection. So, sometimes that comes in the form of looking at the 95th percentile outcomes and just trying to see where's the upside, right? So we can do this here and go like this, right? And a lot of times, again, here, I do like on bigger slates, maybe I feel like I end up doing this 95th percentile thing and kind of seeing where that number is, right? Maybe it's around 17 or 18 points. I've also, sometimes I'll do it with value here. I would say on bigger slates, on slates where there's a lot of value, like this actually looks like one of those slates, I will kind of see what is the best overall projected, like what's the lowest average projected player that projects well on a point per dollar basis, right? And again, that looks like maybe somebody like Bertans, who's projected for about 18 and a half here, 6x value at mid price, like maybe that filters around 18. I also, have some kind of rules of thumb that I will use on certain NBA slate sizes. So on 2-game slates, there's almost always a couple 2-game slates on a given basketball slate. And a lot of times I just end up using that 9 fantasy point number for 2 games. And I don't know why I started doing that here, but I think a lot of times that number ends up being around. Okay. So for this slate, there's not even anybody projected for less than 9, right? But a lot of times, let's see if we can look at the other 2-game slate here. That 9 fantasy point number on a 2-game slate is a lot of times like the end of where I think players that actually have a legitimate chance to get into the game stops, right? For this slate, it might be 7 instead, right? You can kind of see this with the minutes. Right, all these guys projected for 2 minutes. their most common outcomes are generally going to be not even playing, right? These are all just weird kind of outlier. They're not in the rotation, I guess is what I'm saying. Whereas, maybe a guy like Luke Garza, who doesn't play a ton of minutes, right? But his most common outcomes are still getting in the game. Those are the guys that I want in on 2-game slates. So if I was playing this 2-game slate, I would actually probably set this one here at like 7, right? I don't want a ton of Luke Garza. I'm not trying to go all in on Brandon Boston Jr., but if they're going to play and they're going to be in the rotation and I'm playing a 2-game slate, I want them to be in my pool to at least show up in the lineups at the rate at which they're optimal, at least. So on the very, I guess coming around to the point here, on the very small slates, like 2 or 3 game slates, I would say I'm a little bit more particular about like figuring out where that exact line is and getting the players that I want in the pool in my lineups. On a bigger slate, like a 10-game slate, I'm looking for, probably more generally, like where is the line drawn of of players that I think have upside. And a lot of times it ends up being at that 18, I would say somewhere for an average size slate, anything above 6 games or so. A lot of times I put my cutoff at around 18-ish to maybe upwards of 21 fantasy points on average of where I'm cutting off. And that's all just for NBA. A little bit different. I do different things for other sports. I would say for like baseball and even a little bit hockey, I don't think I ever really change the filters. Like I just mostly just leave them alone. Football is a little bit of a different beast. We can talk about football later in the summer when it makes sense to be talking about football. A lot of times football, I have to do this position by position. Like for defenses, I'll just say include all the defenses in the pool. For quarterbacks, I might be more particular about who's in the pool. And then for receivers, running backs, and tight ends, I'll do something kind of similar to what I do for basketball, where I'm picking a general cutoff line and saying, these are the guys I'm cutting off everybody under this. So not a simple answer, unfortunately, not one I can say I always do this. And then I always do, as a result, I always do that. In summary here, I would say small slates, I find where's that last guy that is actually in the rotation? What is his average fantasy points? And I cut off everybody below that. For bigger slates like this, where I don't need to play every player that gets any minutes on the basketball court, I'm instead kind of looking at where's the line of upside. It'll typically be some combination of looking at 95th percentiles or looking at raw value. But the cutoff point is almost always between 17 and 21 points is where I cut that off. And for those of you that are like, what is this? What are we even actually talking about? Because I realize this question kind of comes in with a little bit of context. I edit this number for my NBA slates, I would say fairly often. This is set by default to 15 for everything, which I think is a good baseline number to leave it at. But on smaller slates, I like to bring this down. So I mentioned before, bring that down to 6, 7, 8, 9. On bigger slates like tonight, I think just eyeballing it right now, I like that 18 number. I would probably do something like that. Cut off some of those lower projected guys. So, cool. All right. Kick to the Head has a couple questions. What is a decent process for reviewing your previous day's lineups? I know I can switch to the date at the top and generate any previous days and review and sort by actual score. But if I export my lineups from the previous night, can I import them to SaberSim to review and sort? So you can do that even without you don't have to import anything. You can go in here. So let's go to yesterday and look at the 2-game slate. And see what we've got here. There's a couple, so I'll just kind of show you what the review tools let you do. And then we'll talk about this question a little bit more generally here. Okay. So let's edit some projections here as well. Okay, so review mode, first of all, will basically take the set of lineups that you're looking at. So you could come in here and select a particular set of lineups and then click review mode. And all it's going to do is it's going to sort the pool of 150 by the highest actual score, right? It's the equivalent of going actually into your contest on your phone or on your computer and actually just looking at your individual lineups and how high they scored. You can also come in here and sort by actual score over here, which will take your entire pool of 1,500 and sort it by the highest actual scoring. So you could go in and theoretically find what the actual highest scoring lineup you had in your pool was. To be completely honest, I don't do this that often. I don't think there's a ton of value in actually spending the time to go in and do this. I think my concern here, and what I hear people do a little bit too often, which a lot of times I end up trying to talk people out of, is trying to overly optimize for a slate that already took place in the past, right? Like, you don't want to come in here and spend a bunch of time trying to figure out what particular settings or projections or exposures you could have edited to get the highest actual scoring lineup into your pool, because all that's going to do is it's going to give you a pattern, or it's going to give you some false pattern recognition, right? You're going to assume that there's a pattern there that isn't, based on a one slate sample size or even a small slate sample size if you do this a couple nights in a row, and assume that there's, if you do this thing, right, that you will get good lineups the next time. I think a better overall process for review is, if you made adjustments, right, to a projection or to ownership or something like that, to ask yourself if the thought process behind those adjustments was sound, right? So don't even look at, I'm not even talking results-based thinking, right? Don't necessarily try to figure out if you were necessarily right, but try to look if the inputs were right? Like, let's say last night, you ended up going under on Jokic because the Nuggets have played 6 out of the last 8 nights. And you assumed that maybe Jokic wasn't going to play as many minutes, right? And let's say Jokic goes out and scores 65 fantasy points and has a great game, right? I don't know. I don't think he actually did, right? He had I feel like a pretty more like moderate game, came back down to earth a little bit last night, right? But let's say he only played 30 minutes or something like that. It was just insanely efficient in his minutes, right? That would be something where you could go back and say, okay, that assumption, like that, the way I was thinking about that was accurate, right? You could take this the other way too, right? Let's say Jokic goes out and still has a bad game, but plays 40 minutes, right? Well, that's, that was a bad assumption, even though it ended up kind of working out for you. And I think going through those steps instead over time will allow you to figure out, where am I often making good assumptions? Where am I adding value? And where am I often wrong in the way I'm processing the slate? But if you come in here and do too much with like looking at your lineups that scored the highest amounts in a 1-game sample and trying to figure out how you could have arrived at that lineup, is going to send you down the wrong path. And just to be like completely transparent about what my process looks like, I'm pretty rarely coming in here and doing anything with the review mode and actual mode, actual score. So yeah, I think they can be useful. I've heard from other users about, maybe a little bit more interesting review based processes here. But I think a lot of times I hear about this, in the wrong direction. Like, somebody will ask me, hey, I've been, there was an NBA process we reviewed a couple weeks ago where, there was only point guard in utility allowed, right? And some other rules about player pool, like who could be allowed in the player pool, right? That basically came from evaluating how to get the highest upside lineups into your pool and reviewing high scoring lineups in larger contests, right? Those things that you will see patterns that aren't there going too far down that route. So, and then the other question here was, let's see, at the top of step 1, teams and projected scores. Is this database purely from the simulations, or are there actual Vegas lines considered in the calculations? Good question. Let's jump over to today's slate again. These are purely from the simulations, right? So this number, for example, means that Dallas scores on average, the arithmetic mean of all the simulations is 118.8 points. Vegas is used as an input or a backstop, right? Kind of a guardrail, I guess, is another way of thinking about it, in different sports simulations. Other sports rely on Vegas more heavily. I would say the more are the bigger sports, right? NFL, NBA, baseball use Vegas less than the smaller sports, right? Vegas odds, for example, to win and to top 5 and to top 3 and top 10 in NASCAR races is kind of a core. I would say actually, I don't even have to say. I would say it is a core input to the NASCAR sim. In basketball, the Vegas lines are a little bit more of a guardrail to make sure we're not totally off on a particular game. So when you're looking at these, they are not completely independent from Vegas, but we also do not go in and adjust the numbers manually based on Vegas. The sim is allowed to run and produce the result that it does. But Vegas can potentially be an input or a guardrail to these numbers in certain situations. So, but let me know if that helps. That clears it up. All right. Guy will gamble. Interesting question about what I would call DFS mechanics here. Mechanics are pretty important on the NBA side where speed matters. First time I'm going to be playing on multiple sites. Any tips or pointers on managing that within SaberSim? I upload my own projections and stuff, so any advice is appreciated, especially with late swap involved. Thanks. So a couple things here. I think you're playing multiple sites. So first advice, probably the best advice I can give, if you're not already doing this, put something in, fill all your entries 30 minutes before lock. You'll be happy you did. Just in case, 2 nights ago on the 12-game slate, I got my FanDuel lineups in 13 seconds before the slate locked. I was playing FanDuel and DraftKings, and I didn't do this that night, and I wished I had. Right? I don't even think there was like super late news that particular night. I was just running kind of late getting everything in, and I dearly wished that I had lineups that were 20 minutes old at that point, just so I had something in. I got it in, but I almost didn't. And when you start playing more sites, I think it's very wise to just get that in, right? You are better off not missing lock and having data that is 20 to 30 minutes old that you can work with than missing lock. And at least now it's not as bad as it used to be because you can build lineups from the players playing in the remaining games. But on DraftKings in particular, you used to kind of lose everything there. So I would say that's the best advice I can give. I have also heard from other users that what people like to do is open up a tab for DK and open up a tab for DraftKings. I think that's useful. Getting both of those tabs open at the same time so you can work from both of them. A lot of times I just do everything kind of in one tab, in one particular spot. But I think it can be useful to be working on your DraftKings lineup, set the build, get that running, and then do your FanDuel lineups quickly. Other than that, though, I would say, process-wise, it doesn't change too much. My processes are identical between the two sites. I think this question is mostly about just getting things done quickly. Uploading your own projections, at the moment, it's a little tedious. You'll have to do DraftKings and FanDuel separately. It is our plan. Let's see here. It is our plan long-term to add something for the ability to upload your DraftKings projections and your FanDuel projections all at once, which I think will be pretty cool. But that is not implemented at the moment, so you'll have to do those separately. But overall, I would say, give yourself a little time, start a little bit earlier, but otherwise, process-wise, stays about the same way. So, but let me know if there's any specific questions you have about the differences between the two. Happy to talk a little bit more about that. But two sites, give yourself time, maybe start a couple minutes earlier, but should be about the same. So, and if I remember correctly, based on your question, you had a question earlier this week. I think you were already on FanDuel and now maybe are playing more DraftKings. I could be wrong about that. DraftKings is definitely the easier one. So if you are playing on, in terms of the technical management, if you are playing on FanDuel already and you are familiar with navigating, uploading your lineups and downloading your entries file and late swapping and things like that, already on FanDuel, you'll find DraftKings probably easier and a little less time consuming. So, but all right, cool. I'm going to go jump over to YouTube chat here, hit the YouTube questions real quick. And first hit this one, Aaron, cash lineup in a single entry, can it be plus EV? It can. I remember there was a discussion about this in Slack earlier this week. It certainly can. I don't think it's optimal, right? Ultimately, you can even just see it from the sliders here, right? If this is optimal strategy for cash and this is optimal strategy for small field GPPs, right? Correlation on a big slate is coming up high, but we've seen correlation factors between players in NBA are already a little low. So there's not going to be a significant difference in lineup construction between what is optimal for a small field single entry GPP and a cash game contest. Now, I think literally playing the cash game optimal opens up other problems because the cash game optimal is going to be the same if you ran it in multiple builds, right? You are allowing zero variance into your process by playing the single cash game optimal, right? You open up some issues with duplication. You're probably likely to play like just a much more chalky lineup because it is the mathematical optimal for a particular set of projections for which there can only be one. Even having the sim variance at 1 is going to introduce a lot more natural variance into your lineup construction that gives you the better chance at having a unique lineup. So, like, I would even say that there is actually probably a big advantage to building lineups like this as opposed to like this, even though it doesn't really feel like there is. But with that said, if you built this pool out and you built 500 lineups, it is likely that the actual cash optimal is somewhere in that pool. So I think, yes, I think playing a cash lineup in a sport like NBA in a small field single entry probably is fine. I don't think it's perfectly the optimal approach, though, because you're allowing zero variance into your process, right? You are just playing the optimal. But I remember I saw your comment in the NBA chat that it's working. I'm not surprised by that because I think the cash optimal is probably in the first 500 lineups that the builder would build for a small field single entry, even on one where correlation was a lot higher. But I would probably long-term urge you away from that just so that you're not playing, like the idea of playing any optimal of a particular model in a GPP, I think has inherent problems because you are opening yourself up to being duplicated because people do that, right? And in NBA where, average projections are, I would say it's easier to make a pretty decent set of average projections, right? You're exposing yourself to being duped or to playing a lineup that is just unnecessarily a little chalky. So, but Gamble said, you don't believe in Ish Smith revenge games when I was talking about the revenge game thing. No, I think those are dumb mostly. Like even last night, and I might get some flack for this. I might, but like even last night's like probably the perfect revenge game narrative, or like that these teams are going to play harder. And I just have a hard time believing that there is something that's going to make a professional athlete try so much harder in one game from the next that there is like a predictive aspect in that you could actually predict that a player is going to have a better outcome because they want to try harder in that game. I don't buy that for me. In playoffs, it becomes different because there's actually like a statistical like event that can happen in the form of a player playing more minutes, right? That helps support that. In an elimination game, yes, the players mentally have something to play for more, but also you have the chance of a player that normally plays 34 minutes playing 42. That's a big difference, right? Even last night, I guess what I'm referring to last night is the Sixers-Nets game, right? I just have a hard time imagining that there's statistical predictability in those players not liking the other team enough that they like play better or shoot at a higher percentage or something like that. But I don't know. So Brad says, random, but is there a DK league for SaberSim or something that could be done? I know everyone using the same sim isn't ideal, but I think it would also be cool and another place for us to hang out and chit chat. I don't think we have one. Probably take it upon yourself to get something going if you want. I think you can just create contests. I've seen in other sites like Discords and Slacks and things like that, there's sometimes people that get little pools going for like a single entry, like couple bucks contest. I think that sounds fun, but we don't have anything official set up like that. And then Brad said, I saw yesterday you adjusted using a player with a minimum score or not using. This, I think you're talking about this, right? We talked about this at the start of the stream, the player filters, where you can make adjustments to like where your cutoff line is and who gets into your pool. That's up here. This little filter icon on step 1 will take you there. B-Swifty said, when doing cash lineups, the sim build is 40. Should you switch this according to your lineup size, like winner take all contests for 17 or 36, 50 or 1,000 entries? So the cash, honestly, okay, so, oh, did this get changed? Wait, hold on. I think we changed this. This totally did used to be 20 and 40. Oh, weird. I don't really know what's going on with the default number of lineups and pool size for cash. It looks like it varies based on what it was before you click cash. For cash games, I think like typically something like this, like 1 and 20 or 1 and 10 is fine. You only need one cash lineup, and building, I think, a couple extra lineups in your pool can be useful just to see what other options there are. But I don't think you need to go much further beyond this. With that said, I would probably never use a cash lineup in a winner take all, even if it was small field, right? A winner take all is essentially going to play like a satellite. So I think optimal winner take all strategies would be to use, or I think this, let me put it this way. I think a satellite is going to be the closest thing in our system to winner take all strategy. So I would say if you're playing winner take alls, even small field, right? Even very small field, right? You need to allow some variance into maybe even some ownership attention into your process, because it's 100% to first, right? Upside is important. You don't want to just play a lineup that's optimized to perform at the average. So if you're playing winner take alls, 2 questions here, right? Cash, I would say, this is fine. The 20 to 40 that pops up semi-regularly is also fine. You ultimately just need one lineup. But for winner take alls, assuming it's a multi-entrant winner take all, right? Not a head-to-head. Then you should be doing like satellite or at least GPP settings. So, Aaron said, I started that conversation, had some 1% outcomes with it. Yeah, no, I bet you have. And again, I guess let me put it this way. I imagine that for a small stakes, or not a small stakes, a small field single entry GPP, that playing our cash optimal, for example, is probably not negative EV, because I am almost certain that lineup is going to be in the pool of the first 500 lineups that we would recommend you play into that contest anyway. I don't think it is perfectly optimal to do this. I would rather you build with GPP settings to allow you at least have a little bit of variance in that lineup construction, right? But it's probably not negative EV to do that. So, Guy Will Gamble said, thanks, Jordan. I've been playing FanDuel previously, as you mentioned. Are there differences with the entry editing process for DK? No, not on our side. It's virtually the same on our side. I guess the main thing is like on DraftKings. So on DraftKings, you are basically a 1 click away from downloading your entries file. So you can just click this and it just instantly downloads, right? Because DraftKings makes it easier for us to just go directly to the URL where your entries file lives. So that's for a little bit easier. Similarly, or I guess, yeah, somewhat similarly, DraftKings just has one page where you can upload all of your entries files, and it's always this one. So you don't need to, when you go to the same version of this page for FanDuel, you have to find the slate that you're actually uploading to, and then click that CSV edit button and then upload that file. And you have to let the modal load and things like that. Here, this DraftKings.com/entry/upload is where you upload every entries file for every slate, every sport, everything. And you always upload it here. So it's just a little bit easier in that way too. Late swap, no matter what. That's the other thing, I guess. The one other thing is on FanDuel, you have the upcoming tab and you have the live tab, and you do your upcoming slates on upcoming, and you do your late swaps on live slates in live. DraftKings doesn't make that distinction. Everything, late swap builds, everything like that, all happens on the same page. So that's one thing that I think, like, no, it's not really a big difference in the way to use the entry editor and late swap and things like that, but it's just everything's just a little bit easier on DK, I think. And this is coming from, I would call myself like a FanDuel OG. I found DFS via FanDuel, and I played FanDuel only for years. And I've like since now been playing DraftKings for probably like 3 years, but they are objectively better on that technical side, I think. So, but Daniel said it used to be pretty EV, but now everybody uses an optimizer. Yeah, I think that's kind of like basically what I'm saying is that no, our cash optimal is probably in the pool of viable lineups anyway for that contest. You might arrive at that organically, but because it is literally the cash optimal, it just has this higher than average chance to be duplicated, and that would make it not as good. So, but then Daniel said, not sure when it was, but I saw you said something where you enter 1% of your entries, so you're not overly competing against your own lineups. Can you explain that a bit more? Yeah, so this is like a general rule of thumb that I will use to determine how many lineups I want to play into a smaller field, a somewhat smaller field event, or I guess event. Most contest, right, is the better word. So let me find one here, for example. So actually, you know what I was looking at? Here's one. I was looking at the Xfinity race for this weekend, right? And I was looking at low stakes. Okay. So I was staring at this mini max, right? If I were to enter this contest, right, it's a 150 max, and there are 11.8K entrants in it. I would probably only play about 120 entries into this roughly. If I were to enter this, I don't know if I'm going to, but I would probably, because when I'm building my lineups, I am shooting for the top 1% outcomes, right? It is my goal for each individual lineup to have a top 1% outcome. That's the way I'm thinking about building my lineups. From there, I'm basically saying that, you know, where that lineup ends up in the top 1% is kind of variance. I don't have a ton of control over that, but I can build lineups that are optimized to show up in the top 1%. Well, DraftKings and most of the other sites will frequently let you build. They won't exceed 150. So maybe this isn't as good of an example, but they will allow you to fill up to about 3% of the total lineups in the contest in certain situations, right? I don't want to fill up 3% of the equity in a contest because at that point, I feel like my lineups are competing against themselves for top 1% equity. In other words, if I hypothetically played the contest perfectly and I took up all of the top payout positions, I would essentially be paying my winnings that I win in first, my lineups that are in the top 2 and 3% in that contest would essentially be paying the rake for that top first place finish. I'm paying myself in a way to win. I'm lowering, and another way of looking at it is I'm just lowering my maximum upside there, right? So I don't like to allow myself a situation where I hypothetically could occupy more than the entire top 1% of equity in the contest, because that's where the equity in the contests are. There's not a lot of money in finishing anywhere outside of the top 1% in virtually any contest. So I don't want to put myself in a situation where even though it's completely unlikely to really ever happen, it's a way of me making sure that I can kind of manage my overall investment into contests and make sure that I'm maximizing my potential upside when things go well in those contests. It's not necessarily a hard and fast rule. I don't think there is anything wrong with maxing virtually any contest if it fits into your bankroll management and contest selection principles. It's just what I do. And it really only ends up coming up into play on smaller field contests where the entry limit is over 3%, or where the entry limit is over 1% of the total entries in the contest. So Guy Will Gamble said, tonight's my first night playing DK in at least 4 years. Good luck. I will say also for NBA, I think they're pretty similar. For baseball, I definitely like DK more. I love picking 2 pitchers. The one pitcher thing on FanDuel has always drove me a little crazy. Because I think finding two good pitchers on a lot of slates is tough. And I think I think there's a big edge to be had on the DraftKings side for having to have to pick two pitchers. So Brad likes DK. I think everybody's got one that they kind of prefer more over the other. So, but B Swifty said, do you feel it a little unnecessary to mess with multiple players' exposures when building for lineups? I feel like I have more success with messing with projections unless it's just one player. I would say from talking to different users and doing these streams and even talking to some of our partners and other people at SaberSim, this is another situation where I think people gravitate towards one or the other. Like, I think people ultimately will find that editing exposures or editing projections in step 3 makes a little bit more intuitive sense to them. I have always kind of messed with exposures more than projections. It has always made more sense. It's always been weird. Like, if I look at a guy like Devontae Graham and think that's too much exposure for me, I always have a number in mind, an exact exposure number that I want to hit, and it's easier for me to just go put that number in here. But others may say that it's easier to think about this in terms of projections and that, this projection looks a little high and to take down his projection instead. So I've always naturally just gone with editing exposures over projections a little bit more. With that said, I have recently been talking myself more and more into editing projections, mostly because I've noticed that it gives you a flatter, and we've talked about this a lot this week, it gives you a flatter exposure. It gives you a more even exposure to that player across all of your lineups. So if, for example, let's drop Devontae Graham's projection to something until he's about 50% owned, right? You get the same impact of this. Let's keep going. The one thing is that if you want exactly 50%, it takes a little bit more hand holding here. But since you've dropped his projection, you'll get a little bit more even exposure to him throughout your lineups. So I've been a little bit more interested in editing projection versus exposure here in step 3 recently. But ultimately, functionally, they're going to do the exact same thing. I would say the main thing to be cautious of is that if you're using a rank fill method, unique rank or rank fill, and you want your custom exposures to be kind of even throughout your entire set of lineups, you probably will have more success doing that with editing projections, because then you'll get that player, you'll get 40% Devontae Graham about evenly throughout all of your lineups. Whereas if you set a maximum exposure to Devontae Graham, right, and cap him, you'll probably end up with instead, if we set 40% here, it's probably likely that all 8 of your top lineups have Devontae Graham in it, right? But if you're using a unique fill method, it doesn't matter at all, really. So. Brad said, speaking of baseball and DK, before they went to captain mode, I had the secret figured out. Utilizing relievers in the showdowns, I was winning day in and day out, and then they ruined it for me with the captain mode. That was I was super upset the next season when they started that. Yeah, first of all, there's still a huge edge in using relievers in MLB Showdown. 100%. That is still an edge. Especially, so 2 things. Last season, I would roster relievers in my showdown spot, but I would also do a little bit of a research of who threw recently and like cross out relievers that, threw the day before or 2 days before or whatever. And that was awesome because nobody ever really rosters those guys. With that said, they used to be that relievers in showdown were like super low priced. So now, if I remember correctly, relievers are priced very close to what the minimum priced batter is. So you used to be able to build lineup constructions that nobody else could get to unless they used a reliever. And that was a huge leverage play because you could get combinations of batters that were locked out to anybody that wasn't using a reliever in their lineup. And you would have it was so easy to get a unique lineup. Now you can often get a unique lineup still in baseball by using a reliever, but it's specifically because of the super low ownership of the reliever themselves. And you basically you need that reliever to come in the game and still have a good game. or have a good inning or whatever you need them to do. Before, and I'm sure you're aware of this too, before you used to literally, like, you could put a reliever in the lineup, have that reliever not even get in and throw 0 and win the showdown because of the access to the high expensive batters you were able to get all went off. That was great. You can't do that anymore, but I think there's still a pretty big edge in baseball showdown with relievers. So, but Young God said, when do you really need to mess with the min unique lines? I almost never, I assume you're talking about this, min uniques here. I pretty much never touch this. What this is going to do, I always describe this the same way on stream. This is a very brute force way of forcing diversity into your lineups by making it so when you compare any two lineups in the pool, they need to have 2 players that are unique between them. A much more natural way of getting diversity in your lineups is increasing the sim variance slider. So if you do your build and it feels like your lineups are too similar to you, there's not enough differentiation between your lineups, I would instead increase the sim variance slider, because what that's going to do is it's going to use a wider range of outcomes when we build each lineup, a smaller set of simulations, and you'll get more diversity, but you'll also increase your upside. Whereas the min uniques just changes the rules that the builder has to follow when it builds your lineups. Sim variance increases your upside as it increases diversity. So with that said, basically the only use case that I would ever use min uniques for is if I was building for something where sim variance was already at 10, which for tonight, we don't have a good example of that for tonight's NBA slate, but something like, golf is a good example, where you can sometimes end up with situations where you have lineups that are very similar to one another. If you were building for a sport where sim variance was already at 10 and you still felt like your lineups were too similar, then I think you can be justified in increasing this to like 2. So, B Swifty said, is there any way to save projections that you enter if I were to reset to SaberSim projections to see where the updates have come in? No, unfortunately, there isn't at the moment. We do. That is something that's on our list to add. The ability to upload a projection set, but then save that basically and say like, this is this set, and then to switch back and forth between different sets, or even maybe combine different sets or things like that. So that's on our radar. There unfortunately isn't a very good way to do that at the moment. Okay, I know there were some questions here in Slack. So let's jump back over here and hit these questions from Slack. This is from Phantom. He said, for doing research builds in event-based sports like hockey and MLB around the corner, is it best to leave correlation on the default setting and no stacking rules, and turn on stacking rules and take down the correlation slider? Didn't know if this would be a good way to find out what stack types might be as optimal as well. Interesting. Okay, so first off, like the first part of this question, if your goal is to research stacks, right? If you are intentionally trying to research stacks, I would set a stacking rule. Like if you want to go see what the best 5 stacks are on that slate, set a 5 stack and run a research build and see what comes up. I don't like turning the correlation slider on for research builds, and I've gone back and forth on this, and I think there is content on our YouTube channel right now that says turn the correlation slider on. I think this is I don't think this has a big practical impact. I don't think there's a really wrong way to do this, but I don't like turning the correlation slider on because it's actually going to change the projections of the players as each lineup gets built based on who correlates in that lineup, right? A stacking rule still sets a rule on the builder to force certain players together, but it's not changing the projections of certain players as they go into the lineup. So if you want to research stacks, I think you just set a stacking rule. It's an interesting question here in terms of trying to figure out what are optimal stack types. I would probably, I don't have a great answer to that in terms of like using a research build to determine what stack types are optimal, mostly because like the research build isn't going to take into account correlation. I don't have a good answer to that, to be honest. What I do with my baseball stacks is I will kind of rely on the rules of thumb of, first of all, if you go in and build baseball lineups, you're going to get good stacks automatically without having to set a single rule. Mostly you will be getting your 5-3s, 5-2s, 4-3s, sometimes 5-1-1-1s, sometimes smaller than that on smaller slates. But if you were trying to like research stack sizing with a research build, I don't know how I would go about doing that. I may have to think about that a little bit more, because if you run your research build with no correlation slider and no stack rules, you're going to get virtually no stacks, because the actual mathematical optimal on any given night is likely to be unstacked. But there are such heavy positive correlations in baseball that we obviously want to stack. But I don't know the best way I would go about doing a research build to figure out what the optimal stack sizing might be. I might need to think about that a little bit more. Good question. That'll be one I will continue to think about here as we get a little bit closer to baseball. I think this is mostly a theoretical kind of curiosity question, because in actuality, the correlation slider alone, set to its default value for virtually any contest, is going to build you the right kinds of stacks you need, right? So I don't think you need to. It is not as if you need to sit down, especially for those of you that haven't played baseball before with SaberSim. Your stack sizing is generally taken care of for you. If you go in, and we can just demo this, right? Like let's actually just do this. Let's go back to a slate from last year. Let's do, how about June 25th? That sounds good. June 25th, a nice 13-game slate. I don't know who was on the slate. We don't know who was pitching. We don't know who was hitting. Let's say we were playing 20 max, 10 to 50, and let's build and just see what we get. And you'll see we'll get good stack sizes. We'll get appropriate stack sizes right out of the gate. I just don't know how I would use a research build to further optimize on this. So maybe that's the answer. Maybe there isn't a really good way to add additional value here. But let's see. We'll show you guys this real quick, and then because especially for those of you that joined for football or for basketball this season and haven't had a chance to play baseball with us yet, I think this is pretty cool to see, because it is a bit of a barrier to entry playing baseball with the traditional optimizer, right? Not knowing what kind of stacks are the right way to play, and this is taken care of for you with SaberSim. So, man, it just feels good to be building baseball lineups. I'll tell you what, it feels right. Give this a second here. Kicking the dust off a random June 25th, 2021 slate. I feel like is maybe a little taxing on the system. Just be patient with me here. We're loading. I can tell. Well, maybe we're not. Maybe we'll have to do this another day, because I don't think it will. Oh, all right. We got it. Okay. Stack types, right? 5-3, 5-2, 4-3, 4-4, 4-2-2. Right. So, I mean, virtually taken care of right out of the gate for you. But in terms of researching to identify what amongst these might be the most optimal, it is certainly interesting. So I'll think a little bit more about that. But okay, Dentito. And I have 2 more questions in the queue. So we'll hit these 2 questions and then probably think about getting out of here. If anybody has any other questions that want to ask for today, I would say get them in the queue now so I see them before we close the stream off for today and for the week. But let's hit these 2 first. Hey, Jordan, does setting a rule to have at least 1 or 2 players in a hammer game decrease the chance of having to late swap, barring no player being out in the hammer game? Or do you still prefer to late swap to increase your upside? I would say having a rule to force players from the late game into your lineups ultimately mostly just preserves your flexibility of being able to do so if there is news. So like we were talking about at the start of the stream, if I set a rule saying must have 3 players from the late game in my lineup, it's not to actually play 3 Wizards versus Lakers. It's so that if news breaks at 6 o'clock local time for me, I can delete that rule and know that every lineup has at least 3 lineup positions still in it, and then late swap to take advantage of that news. So with this second question, do you still prefer to late swap to increase your upside? I only late swap when there is news to swap for. So, yeah, I would say that's kind of the way I think about it. If you set a rule to force players from the late game in there, it's not to lower your chance of having to late swap. It's to make sure that you have the maximum flexibility if you do have to. And I would say if something like if the caveat to that, or like the potential catch here, is if you make that rule, at some point you have to remove it and swap. Like at some point you have to get off the bus, right? So if you're saying 3 players from this game in every single lineup to give yourself as much late swap flexibility, right? Like if you let 6 o'clock pass you by and don't swap, there's only 3 games left. The odds that you're going to get slate breaking news at that point maybe go down because there's only 3 games left. And if you let 6:30 go by, then there's only 2, right? So like eventually you have to decide what that off ramp is going to be. If I set that kind of rule, I would probably say like this is my off ramp. Like I would say if no slate breaking news, I would basically say I'm removing that rule and swapping organically at 6 no matter what, just so I don't end up in a situation where I've mindlessly stacked a game to no advantage. But in general, I think it's still a pretty sound strategy for preserving that flexibility. I do still think my favorite way of doing that, though, ultimately, is running the test build, seeing what the best plays are from the early games, and limiting your player pool in those games to only the best plays. Like at the start of the stream, when we ran a build, really the only guy that was like really popping up in a 20 max was Karl Anthony Towns. So I do think it's an interesting idea for tonight's slate to remove all the other players playing from this game and just leave Towns in your pool so that you have a lot of flexibility and you don't end up with like a random guy that's projected for like 4 point, like, so you don't randomly have Cole Anthony taking up a lineup spot, right? Like Cole Anthony could go off, but that lineup spot is more valuable being open for late swap news. I think that's still my favorite way of doing it. So. All right, let's see. And then question from Edward here. What do you think about the opposite of what Aaron Neal said? Play single entry GPP in cash games. I wouldn't do that either, because at that point you're giving up expected value in the form of sacrificing average projected points. Like in cash, it is just objectively the best strategy most of the time. I realize that's a bit of a contradiction as well, objectively most of the time. But, barring some weird circumstance with late swap flexibility or something like that in NBA, it's generally to your advantage to just play the highest projected lineup possible. Leaving your variance slider at 1 or 2 is just ultimately going to lead to you playing a lineup that isn't optimal. In cash games, you're not really punished for being duplicated in the same way as you are in GPPs. And there's no advantage to being different. In fact, there's actually a little bit of an advantage to be the same as other players in the pool. So there's not really any real, actually, so those two things, there's no real punishment for being duplicated. You are actually encouraged to play a lineup that is similar to other players. You have a mathematical reason to play lineups that are higher owned in cash games, right? And you don't spread out your risk, as it is not as effective to spread out your risk in cash games by varying your lineup. You're varying your risk in cash games mostly comes in the form of your contest selection, right? You don't want to sacrifice EV by playing worse lineups than the optimal to lower your variance. So the optimal way to lower your variance in cash is to play a wide number of opponents. So take the same cash lineup, take the optimal cash lineup and pit it against 100 unique players in the form of head-to-heads. rather than playing 100 unique lineups into one contest. So no, for cash, same deal here, right? I would probably not do that. I would not play like a single entry GPP optimized lineup in cash games. And then a question from Shady Advice here. Let's see. For a sport like baseball, the default sliders are optimally back-tested with no stacking rules. Does that mean if you add stacking rules, you should be reducing the slider to not double count the benefit it conferred? I typically say no for this particular question. Mostly if you are setting a stacking rule saying give me at least 5 hitters in a stack, the correlation slider will still make sure that you are appropriately using the most correlated players that you can in that stack, or at least factoring that in as a factor, right? There's still the bigger factor amongst baseball stacks is that every hit that happens removes an out that hypothetically could happen, and everybody gets more opportunities. So you will see there is not significant changes. I would say, like, there's not significant changes between the correlation of the first and the second hitter in the order and the first and the 8th hitter in the order, but there's still a difference there. And the correlation slider will help in a way that is appropriate to the contest that you are playing, more often stack like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Well, also taking into account salaries and things like that, but like give you more lineups that maybe have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rather than 1, 4, 7, 9. You know, you get the idea, right? So short answer is the correlation slider won't hurt here just because you've set a stacking rule. It'll make sure that you're stacked. I think the better analogy actually is football, right? You set a rule that says, give me 2 pass catchers for each stack that I'm playing, a QB plus 2 always, right? I like to leave the correlation slider on in that case because different players are going to have different correlations with the quarterback. I don't arbitrarily want 2 pass catchers. I want 2 of the better correlated players to my quarterback. So I keep the correlation slider on. Same thing for baseball. While it is better in baseball to have 5 arbitrary players from the same lineup in your stack, right? That's obvious. That's generally not going to hurt you. I would rather have the 5 best, or not even necessarily the 5 most correlated, but the 5 correlated adjusted best hitters in my stack when all else being equal. And that's essentially what the correlation slider will help you do. So the risk of turning correlation down to 0 in baseball, provided you've already set a stacking rule, is much lower than it is in football, but I still like to leave it on for that reason. And actually, you know what, let's pull this back up and maybe we could just look at this real quick before we take off. And I'll show you kind of a little bit more of what I mean here. So let's look at, okay. We'll look at the last game of the World Series here. So Altuve and Brantley hit second. We don't have batting orders here, right? But you can see Altuve's strongest correlation is to Michael Brantley. Now, he's obviously correlated to the other players in the lineup, right? But I don't want to discount the fact that Altuve is twice as correlated to Brantley as he is to Jordan Alvarez, just because I've set a stacking rule forcing 5 stacks for the Astros into my lineups already. I still want this data to present itself. So, good question though. And then last question here. This is the last one for the day. Larry, do you set max players from one team on a 10-game slate if research leans that way? As of very recently, yes. Yeah. I have just started doing that because I think the research build is a compelling reason to do it. Mostly because there are no real significant positive correlations in basketball. Nothing reliable that you can lean on. So I think using a research build to figure out what are the maximum combinations of players that can show up together in an optimal lineup can be a pretty good guardrail to prevent a situation from building a lineup that doesn't fit that construction, right? So there are probably lineups like, let's run one for tonight for a 10-game slate, especially maybe for those of you that didn't get to see. So I talked about this earlier this week. So what I've been doing recently, and I've talked about a lot here before, why I think research builds can be difficult to use effectively for NBA. And the biggest one is that news breaks late, and it's difficult to do a research build, to analyze it, and then to take an action all in the last 5 or 10 minutes before lock, which is typically what you are required to do. But for what I've been doing recently for NBA is running a research build and using it as a way to study the stack types to figure out where I want to limit my max number of players per team. And I think that works. Mostly because news breaking, I think the biggest factor in terms of what an appropriate number of players per team on a slate is generally going to be the size of the slate. I would not say there's news that could break that could, apart from maybe a situation where there is a ton of value that has opened up on one team. There's typically not news that is going to break that's going to change my point of view about how to do this optimally. So I've been running this research build, and I've been studying stack types. And on tonight, for example, I would probably never want to have 4 players from the same team. I think I would probably be comfortable having 3 players from the same team. There are about 9% of the optimals have a situation where 3 players from the same team are on it. So I would probably set it at 3, personally. I would probably not spend too much energy trying to talk you out of max 2 players from one team. But if you were to do that, I think it's possible that you are going to cross off good lineups out of your list, and you're also leaving yourself to a situation where that rule could potentially age poorly, right? Like if, let's see. If Torian Prince, Anthony Edwards, Jared Vanderbilt, and Jordan McLaughlin all get ruled out for the Timberwolves, it's probably likely that there are some 3 T-Wolves stacks that are good lineups, and that rule might age poorly. So for me tonight, I would probably set it at max 3 per team. So, yeah, I love that. Cool. We'll leave it there for today. Thanks, everybody. Tuned in, asked questions, listened, participated. We'll be right back here again next week, 2 p.m. Eastern on Monday. Enjoy your weekend. Good luck in your contests and any DFS you're playing over the weekend, and we'll see you all next week. See ya.